Look up into the night sky of any world in the Emperor's domain, and you will see a canvas of absolute nothingness. The void of real space is a comforting lie. It is cold, it is dead, and it is mercifully silent. We tell ourselves that this silence is the natural order of the universe, a barren frontier waiting to be conquered by our steel and our logic. But behind the thin, fragile curtain of reality lies a truth so terrifying that men tear out their own eyes just to escape the memory of it. I have listened to the whispers of the Imperium. I have charted the tides of the Imperium, and I have lost irreplaceable pieces of my soul to its undertow. The warp is not a place. It is not a dimension of alternate coordinates or a simple medium for faster travel. It is an infinite, boiling ocean of pure, sentient malevolence. It is the accumulated psychic runoff of quadrillions of suffering beings, coalesced into a realm where the laws of physics simply do not exist. In that place, hatred possesses a crushing physical weight. Consider the sheer volume of pain in our galaxy. Think of every scream that has ever echoed across 1,000 apocalyptic battlefields. Think of every dying gasp of a starved hive serf, every sadistic thrill of a murderer, and the paranoid terror of a planetary governor watching their world burn. None of this raw emotion simply vanishes into the ether. It bleeds through the fabric of the materium and pools together in the dark. Every act of cruelty in our blood-soaked galaxy acts as fuel for the unending storms that rage beyond the veil. While the void of space is an empty tomb, the warp is overwhelmingly, terribly alive, and it is always watching us. This is the great, undeniable cosmic irony at the heart of human survival. We build an empire of rigid order, of blessed machines and unbreakable dogma, yet we are completely, utterly dependent upon the very antithesis of reason. To bind together 1,000,000 scattered worlds, to transport our armies and feed our starving planets, humanity must deliberately plunge its monumental metal leviathans into the primordial abyss. We demand survival as a species, and the price we pay is constant proximity to damnation. We trust in a few meager layers of cold adamantium and the flickering, invisible bubble of a Gellar field to hold back a hungry, infinite ocean. An ocean that wants nothing more than to peel the sanity from our minds and unravel our flesh into screaming monuments of agony. The profound tragedy is not merely that we must travel through a dimension of ancient nightmares. The true horror is that we ourselves created the unseen predators that dwell there, gorging them upon 10 millennia of our own endless, bitter warfare. Yet the cogs of the administratum demand their tithes, and so the vast orbital docks of the Imperium continue to load their massive freighters. The sanctioned mutants of the Navis Nobilitae take their thrones in the suffocating dark of the navigation spires. Colossal warp engines ignite, shuddering with the esoteric fury of forbidden technologies. The boundary between the cold, dead universe and the boiling sea of madness prepares to shatter. To know the theory of the Imperium is one matter, but to physically cross its threshold is a trauma etched into the soul of every voidfarer. As an Imperial vessel prepares for translation, a profound and unnatural silence falls over the cavernous corridors. This is the final, breathless calm before the ultimate violation of physical law. The ambient temperature suddenly drops to frigid extremes, stealing the warmth from the lungs of thousands of mortal ratings pressed into the claustrophobic depths of the lower decks. A sharp, metallic tang of copper floods the mouth, a sensory phantom born of reality beginning to fray at the edges. An unspoken, primal panic ripples through the crew as they grip their stations in terrified anticipation. Then the vast macro mechanisms of the warp drive engage. The ship does not merely slip into another dimension. Instead, it commits an act of extreme, unmitigated violence against the very fabric of nature. The drive engines unleash esoteric energies that tear a jagged, bleeding hole in the skin of real space. Through this agonizing rupture, the immense vessel is violently thrust out of the material universe and into a realm where physical matter is a despised anomaly. The sheer physical toll of this split-second event is cataclysmic. The ship's ancient superstructure groans and shudders as if in mortal agony. Million-ton adamantium bulkheads scream under the pressure of impossible paradoxical physics. Inside the dim belly of the beast, the mortal crew suffers what the Officio Medicae terms translation shock. Human physiology violently rejects the sudden shift into an immaterial realm of pure, unbridled chaos. Among the multitudes of press-ganged souls laboring in the dark, the weak-willed succumb instantly to the psychic whiplash. Nosebleeds burst from the faces of sturdy gunnery sergeants. Violent, bone-cracking seizures take the deckhands who inadvertently stare into the flickering shadows. Sudden, inexplicable bouts of desperate weeping overtake hardened armsmen as their subconscious minds register the howling eternity pressing against the outer hull. It is a moment of pure, blinding agony as the human mind is briefly stretched across the cosmic divide. Every mortal aboard prays blindly to the God Emperor that the invisible bubble of the Gellar field holds fast against the ravening nightmare outside. Yet mere survival upon entering the Imperium is not enough to secure a crossing. Blindly drifting within this roiling ocean of madness would mean certain damnation for all aboard. The ship's master is utterly blind to the currents of the warp. The mechanical cogitators are rendered completely useless by the shifting dimensions. Mortal senses offer nothing but profound deceit and creeping insanity. To actually chart a path through this howling, unnatural storm requires a mind specifically bred for the darkness. The vessel must rely upon a mutant strain of humanity uniquely designed to gaze directly into the abyss without instantly shattering into 1,000 pieces. To traverse the boiling madness of the Imperium without being instantly torn asunder requires more than mere iron and adamantium. It requires a guide. This is the grim burden of the navis nobilitae. To the uninitiated masses of the Imperium, the navigators are exalted aristocrats of ancient lineage. In truth, they are a heavily sanctioned mutant strain, cloistered aristocrats who endure unimaginable psychological torment to serve an empire that secretly fears and despises them. Generations of deliberate inbreeding and relentless exposure to the warp have warped their forms into something barely human. Beneath their opulent silken robes hide elongated, spindly limbs that end in multi-jointed digits. Their skin is sickly and translucent, stretched tight over brittle bones to reveal a lattice of pulsing, darkened veins. But their most defining and horrific feature remains carefully hidden behind warded silken cowls and esoteric visors. It is the true mark of the navis nobilitae, the dreaded third eye that sits squarely upon their mutated brows. To look upon it bare is to invite instant, agonizing death, for it is a window directly into hell itself. High above the labyrinthine decks of the void ship rests the navigator sanctum. It is a heavily shielded, solitary spire, isolated from the millions of waking souls who toil in ignorance below. Here, absolute silence reigns. The navigator is locked within a grand suspension throne, a cage of life support cabling and ancient machinery that elevates them above the mundane world. They are utterly alone in the dark. Their physical body may remain tethered to the spire, but their mind is violently stretched across the infinite abyss. It is a life of terrifying isolation, surrounded by cold walls of inscribed hexagrammic wards that offer only a fragile illusion of safety. The terrifying reality is that the very survival of the vessel and every soul aboard depends entirely upon a single, wretched mutant who is slowly and inevitably losing their sanity. When the void ship finally breaches the veil, the navigator opens their third eye to perceive the unperceivable. They do not see the Imperium as mortals would. Mortal minds would snap and mortal eyes would melt from their skulls at such a sight. Instead, the navigator perceives the warp as a swirling, impossible vortex of violent colors and shifting ethereal currents. These currents do not merely flow. They sing with the endless, wailing voices of the damned. Every moment spent gazing into the sea of souls is an agonizing battle of wills. Formless predators and nameless entities circle the vessel, whispering honeyed lies and horrifying truths directly into the navigator's fraying mind. The creatures of the warp constantly try to lure them off course, seeking to shatter their fragile psyche and drag the ship into eternal torment. The navigator must ignore these seductive whispers and stare unflinchingly into the devouring madness. Yet even the most powerful psychic mutant cannot chart a course through pitch darkness blindly. The swirling tides of the Imperium shift and boil with every passing second, rendering all mortal maps utterly useless. To survive the crushing pressure of the abyss and guide the ship toward real space, the navigator must search for a single, desperate point of reference. Their ruined mind casts outward through the raging storms, filtering out the shrieks of starving demons to find a specific, blinding salvation. They scour the shifting temporal tides for a singular piercing beam of golden fire shining from across the galaxy. Through the blistered eye of the mutant navigator, that desperate search for a fixed point in the madness finally finds its anchor. But what they perceive is no gentle beacon of celestial majesty or divine salvation. It is the Astronomicon, a screaming pillar of psychic fire that violently tears through the fabric of the Imperium. It is a lighthouse of cosmic horror, a brutal and agonizing beam of authoritarian will that scorches the turbulent ocean of darkness. To look upon it with the inner eye is to witness a bleeding wound in the warp, radiating a blinding, terrible light that demands absolute subjugation from the chaos around it. This is the pyre of the Emperor, and its holy radiance is fueled entirely by the sacrificial burning of mortal souls. Deep within the hollow mountain on Holy Terra, a chained chorus of 10,000 psychers sits entombed within archaeotech mechanisms. Day by day, their vital essence is systematically drained, their unique minds and cherished memories burning away to fuel the great beacon, while the master of mankind directs its blinding light. They are consumed alive by the machinery of the Imperium, their very souls slowly burned down to choking ash over agonizing months of service to sustain the Emperor's holy light. Their collective death scream merges with the undying, tortured consciousness of the master of mankind, creating a singular note of defiance that shines across the fractured Imperium, though even its holy fire cannot pierce the suffocating darkness of the Great Rift. Yet, one must understand the terrible nature of illumination within the warp. Where there is a blinding light, there are infinitely dark shadows cast behind every unnatural wave of the Imperium. Predators of the abyss, ancient horrors of unnamed geometries and bottomless hunger, gather at the very edges of the Emperor's scorching radiance. They circle the periphery of the beam like grotesque abyssal fish drawn to a bioluminescent lure in the deepest, blackest oceanic trenches. They cannot endure the direct, purifying heat of the Astronomicon, but they wait patiently in the encroaching gloom. They feed on the psychic runoff of passing vessels and wait for any momentary lapse in the navigation. For the crews of void ships pushing outward toward the galactic fringe, this reality breeds a unique and suffocating terror. As the Leviathan vessel travels ever further from Terra, the violent golden beam begins to wane and fracture. The terrible dread of the flicker sets in upon the bridge. It is that agonizing, heart-stopping moment when the Emperor's light stutters against the overwhelming, suffocating tides of the warp. If that light fails completely, the navigator is instantly blinded, leaving the ship untethered from its course, lost forever in an endless, shifting labyrinth and doomed to drift until the stars burn out. The navigator must rely entirely on this painful, blinding beam to chart their desperate course, holding onto a burning tether that sears their mind. But the spiritual beacon alone cannot keep the primordial nightmare from clawing at the outer hull. As the immense ship rides the frayed edges of the Emperor's screaming fire, the physical integrity of the vessel is tested to its absolute limit against a fundamentally corrosive environment. To chart a course through the madness of the Imperium is only half the burden of survival. The navigator may see the path, but sight alone cannot shield a vessel from the ravenous hunger of the warp. Imperial captains speak of the Gellar field in the sterile terminology of engineering. They praise the hum of the field generators and the comforting green runes of the bridge readouts. It is a merciful, necessary lie. The truth of our salvation is far more grotesque, hidden away in the most heavily armored vaults of the lower decks. The Gellar field is not merely a conventional barrier of energy generated by humming coils. At its dark core, it is the projected aura of a sleeping human mind. At the cold heart of this arcane machinery lies a sealed nutrient vat, bathed in the sickly luminescence of preservation lamps. Suspended within the thick chemical amniotic fluid is a mutant of the Psyker breed. They are stripped of their humanity long before the vessel ever leaves orbit. Their limbs are often amputated to prevent violent thrashing in the throes of their endless nightmare. Their eyelids are surgically fused shut. Countless invasive shunts, cerebral plugs, and life support cables are driven deep into their cortex, binding their living nervous system to the cold adamantium spine of the ship. This wretched creature is rendered permanently comatose to the waking world, sustained entirely by an alchemical cocktail of heavy suppressants. Yet, within the caged confines of their ruined skull, the mind is forced to remain terrifyingly active. The esoteric machinery of the Imperium weaponizes the very soul of the mutant. Through archaic psychomechanics, the psyker is subjected to a permanent, chemically induced dream. They are forced to dream of reality. The Gellar field is a terrifying symbiosis of arcane technology and the psychic projection of this slumbering subconscious. As the vessel plunges into the chaotic unreality of the immaterium, the traumatized mind in the vat projects a desperate, localized bubble of normal space around the hull. The psyker's intrinsic subconscious belief in the laws of physics acts as a tether. Gravity, linear time, and solid matter are violently enforced against the chaos of the warp by the sheer psychic weight of a mind trying to remember the material universe. It is a horrifying mechanism of salvation. Consider the sheer, maddening vulnerability of this arrangement. A glorious Imperial cruiser measuring kilometers in length and bristling with apocalyptic weaponry possesses almost no innate defense against the demonic tides beyond its fragile hexagrammic wards. The lives of hundreds of thousands of souls aboard rely entirely on a singular, impossibly fragile point of failure. From the lowest press-ganged rating bleeding in the bilges to the arrogant shipmaster in the gilded spire, every breath is owed to the fevered imagination of a mutilated outcast. They are protected from eternal torment by a fragile, fluid-filled jar. If the delicate alchemical balance falters, or if the nutrient wash fails to suppress the horrors pressing against the veil, the dream will violently end. Should the martyr awaken, even for a fraction of a heartbeat, the projected aegis of reality will inevitably shatter. To comprehend the true horror of warp transit is to understand the absolute fragility of our existence. The Gellar field is no impenetrable fortress of stone and iron. It is a microscopic skin of reality stretched taut over a void of unimaginable malice. A void ship within the Imperium is akin to a fragile armor-glass abyssal bell descending into the crushing black depths of a pelagic death world, surrounded not by crushing water but by an infinite ocean of pure malice. The Imperium is not a distant hazard separated by the cold gulfs of empty space. It is right there, pressing directly against the atoms of the adamantium hull plating. The entities of the Imperium do not merely float past our vessels in uncaring ignorance. They are drawn to the vibrant scent of human souls like starving beasts to a fresh slaughter. They actively press against the invisible barrier of the field. They are hunting for the slightest fluctuation, the tiniest tear in the membrane of sanity. They are predators circling a dying campfire in a forest of total darkness. For the miserable souls stationed near the outer hull, this proximity brings an auditory horror that serves as an inescapable torment. If you were to press your ear against the freezing adamantium of the vessel's outer hull, you would not hear the silent majesty of the cosmos. You would hear them. The inhabitants of the outer decks hear the scraping constantly. It is the unmistakable sound of impossibly massive claws testing the adamantium, dragging across the length of the ship in search of a weakness to exploit. They hear muffled laughter echoing through a vacuum that should carry no sound at all. It is a mocking, wet sound that burrows into the mortal mind and breeds terrible, waking nightmares. Even the physical environment of the ship rebels against the unnatural proximity of the warp. Thick, unnatural frost forms on the inside of the bulkheads, smelling faintly of ancient blood and ozone. The iron corridors groan under a spiritual pressure that mortal physics cannot measure. The invisible aegis of the Gellar field is constantly warping and buckling under the sheer psychic weight of the unreality trying to crush it. The field does not simply repel the warp in a passive state. It wrestles with the nightmare in a continuous, exhausting battle of metaphysical attrition. Every scraping claw is a reminder of this desperate struggle. Every icy breath exhaled by the terrified voidsman on the outer decks is a silent prayer to the God Emperor that the generators hold for just one more second. The denizens of the deep are always waiting, always pushing, hungry for the feast of mortal minds and flesh trapped within the shell. To survive in these outermost corridors requires a hardening of the soul that borders on madness itself. Down in the freezing dark, pressed right against the very edge of total annihilation, the lowest castes of the ship live their wretched lives in the shadow of this ravenous tide. Beneath the humming veil of the unseen barrier lies a realm of suffocating despair. Here, in the deepest bowels of the macro vessel, the indentured voidsmen endure a miserable existence within coffins of adamantium. Generations are born, bleed, and turn to ash in the sweltering dark of the engine decks without ever laying eyes upon a single star. Their reality is a claustrophobic hell of grinding poverty and deafening mechanical thunder. They toil in the shadows of colossal pistons and leaking plasma conduits, their bodies broken by the relentless demands of the great machine. Yet, the physical torment of their labor is nothing compared to the unspoken terror that descends when the vessel tears its way into the Imperium. When the translation klaxons sound, a suffocating dread settles over the lower ratings. The Void's men know all too well the nightmare that churns just inches beyond the hull plates. A rigid, paranoid culture governs these wretched souls during every warp transit. Heavy iron bulkheads are sealed shut by muscle and rusted wheel, turning every subdeck into an isolated tomb. Mirrors, glass, and polished metals are strictly forbidden by ancient deck law. Every reflective surface is shattered or smeared with heavy grease, lest something terrible look back from the other side. Desperate, fearful prayers to the God Emperor echo through the rust-choked corridors, chanted over the rhythmic pounding of the failing atmospheric cyclers. Paranoia becomes the absolute, unforgiving law of the dark. Crewmen watch each other with bloodshot, suspicious eyes, constantly searching for the slightest crack in a comrade's sanity. Mercy does not exist in the deep decks during a warp voyage. If a rating begins to mutter to themselves, or if they stare just a fraction too long into the creeping shadows, the response of their peers is immediate and brutal. Savage beatings are administered by shift bosses wielding crackling shock mauls, desperately trying to beat the madness out before it can take root in the crew. If the whispers continue, or if a voidsman begins to scratch at their own eyes, they are summarily executed. Their broken bodies are cast into the nearest plasma incinerator without hesitation or mourning. The indentured clans of the lower decks enforce this violent purity because they understand the true stakes of failure. A single compromised mind can serve as a festering gateway for the horrors waiting outside. They cling to their tarnished aquila pendants and their brutal discipline, hoping only to survive another cycle in the abyss. But despite their desperate prayers, their shattered mirrors, and their murdered kin, the darkness below decks holds no true safety. The thick adamantium hull may keep the raw tides of the storm at bay, but it cannot stop the slow, insidious bleed of the Imperium. Even as the invisible barrier holds strong against the screaming void, the recycled air grows impossibly cold, and the shadows in the corners of the room begin to stretch just a little too far. The whispers they so violently sought to silence begin to echo from the rusted ventilation shafts, not from the dry mouths of madmen, but from the unholy depths of the ship itself. The mortal mind was never meant to perceive the abyss, yet the abyss constantly presses against the fragile bubble of our reality. To traverse the Imperium is to inhabit a tomb of screaming iron, separated from ultimate damnation by an invisible layer of energy. Yet the Gellar field is a shield of science, not a divine ward, and it is never entirely impermeable. Even operating at peak efficiency, a microscopic osmosis of dread seeps through the wards. This psychic bleed-through permeates the lower decks like a localized contagion. Nightmares become viral. A terror dreamt by a rating in the port hab blocks is soon dreamt by the macro cannon loaders on the starboard flank, spreading through the crew in a shared delirium of unseen teeth and unblinking eyes. Physical reality within the ship begins to subtly sour under the ambient pressure of the warp. Nutrient paste tastes of crematorium ash, and the reclaimed water runs thick, dark and foul with an unnatural viscosity. In the deep corridors, the pale lumens cast shadows that elongate without a light source, separating from the men who cast them and twitching with an independent, hateful malice. Inquisitors and scholars of the esoteric refer to this creeping degradation as warp taint, or the sickness of the soul. It is the psychological friction of existing too close to the raw stuff of chaos. The sheer, oppressive weight of the Imperium crushes the human spirit, acting as a catalyst for the darkest corners of the subconscious mind. Latent neuroses, buried deep within the overworked crew, are forced into full bloom, transforming silent anxieties into violent, inescapable psychosis. Men and women who have served the Emperor faithfully for decades find their sanity eroding, hollowed out by the whispers that leak through the adamantium hull. Deep within the engineerium sublevels, a devout voidsman ceased his endless labor at the plasma conduits. He did not scream, nor did he attack his overseers. He simply dropped his heavy tools and turned to face the blank, riveted expanse of the inner bulkhead. For 3 hours, he stared into the unyielding iron, his eyes wide and unblinking, while thick streams of blood began to run from his tear ducts and stain his grimy collar. He whispered secrets that the iron had told him, secrets of dead stars and flesh without form. Such an anomaly is a deadly spark in a chamber filled with the volatile gas of mass panic. The ship's enforcers arrived with merciless swiftness. A thunderous blast from a provost armsman's naval shotgun to the back of the weeping man's skull silenced his blasphemous communion, and his body was immediately incinerated to prevent the crew from dwelling upon his madness. Discipline on a void ship in transit is maintained solely by the promise of immediate summary execution by the provost armsman. The deafening crack of the executioner's shotgun is a necessary rhythm, a brutal metronome that keeps the surviving crew focused on their duties rather than the encroaching darkness. But summary executions can only cull the weak, and they cannot repair a fraying shield. The viral madness and the bleeding eyes were merely symptoms of a far greater catastrophe brewing within the generatorium shrines. Beneath the decks, the holy machinery was beginning to weep. The ancient field emitters, strained beyond their capacity by the churning tides of the Imperium, were about to experience their first fatal stutter. Then came the unthinkable. The tension that had gripped the vessel shattered in a catastrophic instant. Deep within the armored sanctums of the generatoria, a momentary power fluctuation choked the ancient machinery. It was a flicker. A mere microsecond of mortal time elapsed on the ship, chronometers before the dials began to spin in a frenzy of meaningless, impossible numbers. But in the boundless depths of the Empyrean, time is a fluid and deceitful thing. To the predatory entities lurking outside the hull, a microsecond is an eternity of open doors. The omnipresent hum of the plasma drives, the comforting heartbeat of the vessel, vanished abruptly. In its place fell a profound, suffocating silence that pressed against the eardrums like a physical weight. The lumens flickered and died simultaneously, plunging the claustrophobic corridors into absolute, sightless darkness. Panic erupted through the stillness. The presiding tech priests emitted burst transmissions of frantic, corrupted binaric cant, their cold logic engines violently seizing as scrap code and paradox flooded their augmetics. Deep within the shielded choir chambers, the dreaming psyker seized violently within their amniotic vat. Their fragile mind was suddenly exposed to the naked, laughing madness of the abyss, causing their physical form to thrash until the nutrient fluids boiled with psychic heat. For the mortal crew, there was only paralysis. They stood frozen in the suffocating dark, gripped by the sheer psychological shock of a single, undeniable truth. The Gellar field, their solitary shield against the primordial abyss, had failed. In that imperceptible fraction of a second, the localized breakdown of reality was absolute. The immutable laws of physics dissolved upon contact with the unreality of the warp. A terrifying inversion of existence bled through the adamantium hull. In the portside corridors, a voidsman screamed in terror as his own shadow suddenly detached from the deck plating. The two-dimensional silhouette coiled upward, wrapping featureless, immaterial hands around his throat. It strangled the life from him before he could even draw a breath, leaving his corpse to collapse without casting a shade. Nearby, a heavy adamantium bulkhead sealing the engineerium softened and horribly mutated. For 3 agonizing seconds, the metal transformed into a sprawling mass of wet, breathing flesh. It wept black blood from impossible pores, expanding and contracting with lungs that should not exist before snapping brutally back into cold, scarred steel. Sanity fractured alongside the structural integrity of the ship. The flicker passed, and the massive field generators screamed back to life in a cascade of sparking conduits, but the damage was already done. The spiritual barrier had fallen just long enough to let the outside in. The unnatural silence gave way to the scratching, chittering whispers of things that should never cross the threshold of reality. Gravity inverted itself in isolated pockets, sending screaming ratings plummeting upward to break their bones against the ceiling grid. The recycled atmosphere grew dense and heavy, reeking with the sickening stench of ozone and rotting meat. The microsecond lapse had birthed a terminal sickness in the very architecture of the ship. The fundamental fabric of reality was now unraveling deck by deck, infected by the maddening geometry of the Imperium. The momentary flickering of the Gellar field was but a prelude to the true nightmare that now unfolded within the vessel. Reality itself shattered against the encroaching tide of the Imperium. The sacred geometry of the ship, blessed by the tech priests of Mars, began to actively rebel against the most basic laws of physics. Squads of naval armsmen and hardened voidsmen found themselves hopelessly lost in a labyrinth of impossible design. Vast corridors, once straight and true, now looped back upon themselves in endless, paradoxical circles. A desperately retreating squad, marching forward to secure a defensible bulkhead, would suddenly find themselves staring in horror at the terrified backs of their own formation. The comforting certainty of up and down lost all meaning as local gravity wells collapsed and inverted at random. Screaming ratings fell upward to shatter their bones against the vaulted ceilings of the macro-cannon batteries. Others were instantly crushed into unrecognizable pulp as the immense, invisible weight of the ship suddenly shifted to pin them against the starboard walls. This was no mere structural failure, for the warp does not merely break reality, it actively perverts it. The cold, utilitarian architecture of the Imperial vessel began a terrifying transmutation, seamlessly melding with organic and malefic concepts born from the chaotic depths of the Imperium. Cold plasteel softened into bruised, pulsing flesh that bled sacred promethium and black bile. Heavy blast doors, built to withstand the immense pressures of the void, hissed open to reveal not adjacent compartments, but vast fleshy abysses lined with gnashing, jagged teeth. Other hatches opened directly into the freezing vacuum of space, yet this void was not empty. It was an ocean of madness, filled with colossal, screaming faces woven from starlight and nebula dust that stretched across the cosmos to glare at the trespassers. The ship itself was no longer a loyal vessel of the Emperor. It had awakened as an xenos, hostile entity, a ravenous predator of the warp actively trying to digest the helpless mortals trapped within its metallic bowels. Desperate squads seeking the safety of emergency escape pods found their charted routes vanishing before their very eyes. The promise of salvation was cruelly replaced by jagged dead ends made of fused human bone, weeping iron, and agonizingly twisted cables. Every frantic footstep squelched upon deck plating that breathed, shivering with a dark, predatory anticipation as the ship slowly consumed its own crew. The mortal servants of the Imperium were now entombed within a living nightmare, sealed inside a digestive tract of pure madness where the architecture itself sought their total ruin. Men and women wept in the perpetual dark, huddled in corners that defied Euclidean geometry, waiting for a death that the monstrous vessel was far too cruel to deliver quickly. Yet the horrors of the warped flesh, the bleeding walls, and the shifting gravity were only the physical manifestations of their inescapable doom. As the physical exits sealed themselves permanently shut with hardening cartilage and rusted steel, the insidious intelligence of the warp reached deeper into the vessel's intricate systems. The ship had effectively isolated its panicked prey in inescapable pockets of twisted space, and now it prepared to break their fragile minds. Across the labyrinthine decks, the dead iron of the internal communication network began to hum with a sickening, unnatural power. Physical reality was only the first casualty of the breach. Now the Imperium sought to dismantle the minds of the crew, weaponizing the very senses they relied upon for survival. The shipwide internal communications network ceased to broadcast the frantic orders of the bridge. Instead, the brass-rimmed voxcasters lining the corridors began to whisper. They spoke not in the sterile tones of servitors, but in the intimate cadences of the long dead. Gunnery ratings heard the voices of forgotten childhood friends calling from the shadowy bilges. Deckhands wept as the comms relays played back their deepest, unspoken regrets, echoing them down the vaulted halls. To understand the horror of the warp is to understand that it is not merely a dimension of monsters, but an ocean of conscious malice. The Imperium possesses no form of its own, so it plunders the minds of mortals to construct its tortures. It seeks out the cracks in a human soul, the festering wounds of guilt and sorrow. Every failure, every broken oath, and every buried shame is drawn out into the light and given a voice. The warp drinks from the reservoir of human suffering, shaping raw psychic energy into perfect audio phantoms that are indistinguishable from reality. It does not just want to kill a man, it wants to break his spirit so utterly that he welcomes the end. Nowhere was this cruel alchemy more potent than in the forward command posts. A hardened ship officer, a veteran of countless void engagements, sat huddled behind heavy barricades of plasteel and munition crates. His sidearm was drawn, his hands trembling as he stared blindly into the dark. In his ear, his personal vox bead crackled to life. It was not his commander speaking to him, but the small, frightened voice of his daughter. She had perished of lung rot on a hive world 2 decades prior. Yet now she sobbed into his earpiece, begging her father to open the exterior airlock because she was so incredibly cold. The impossibly real sound of her small fists pounding against the vacuum-sealed hull echoed through the comms channel. The officer wept, his finger slowly tightening on the trigger of his Les pistol as the impossible plea broke his mind. The psychological assault did not spare the sacred architecture of the vessel itself. The ship possessed an ancient and noble machine spirit, a consciousness woven into its kilometers of circuitry and cogitator banks. As the warp infected its systems, the machine spirit realized it was being violated. It reacted in pure, unadulterated agony. Over the ship-wide Vox network, a sound erupted that defied all mechanical logic. It was a colossal, metallic shriek of absolute suffering that tore through the ship. The noise was so violently loud that it shattered the eardrums of anyone not wearing sealed helms. Blood poured from the ears of ratings and officers alike as the vessel screamed its own death knell. Driven deaf, tormented by ghosts, and trapped in the belly of a dying, shrieking leviathan, the last vestiges of human reason evaporated. Men drew their blades, looking to their brothers in the dark, with eyes full of utter, murderous ruin. Long before the first Neverborn set foot upon the physical decking, the mortal crew had already been utterly defeated. The preceding hours of shifting geometries and phantom chorus lines were merely the prologue to a total, systemic collapse of human reason. The reality of the Imperium is a poison that the mortal brain simply cannot metabolize. Faced with an environment that actively defied the fundamental laws of physics, the crew experienced an epidemic of sheer catastrophic hysteria. Madness in these final hours was not a failing of discipline, but a desperate evolutionary defense mechanism. The mind, unable to process the absolute wrongness of its surroundings, chose to violently shut down its own sensory inputs rather than perceive the impossible. Men and women of the lower decks turned upon themselves with whatever crude implements they could find. Hundreds clawed their own eyes from their skulls, desperate to stop seeing the impossible bleeding hues that wept from the adamantium bulkheads. These were not natural shades of light, but predatory colors that tasted of copper and whispered of ancient sins. Veteran Void engineers, stalwarts who had maintained the plasma drives through decades of grueling service, pressed the roaring emitters of plasma cutters to their own ears and engaged the ignition relays. They deafened themselves willingly, permanently searing away their own hearing just to drown out the maddening voices that promised them twisted salvation. The ship became a sprawling slaughterhouse of self-inflicted agony, echoing with the shrieks of a crew attempting to blind and deafen themselves to a truth too horrific to endure. To look upon the naked warp without the protective aegis of the Emperor is to invite instantaneous physical and spiritual corruption. The unshielded human form is incredibly malleable when exposed to the raw stuff of chaos. Spontaneous, chaotic mutation began to ripple through the surviving population like a virulent plague. Flesh melted and re-knitted under the gaze of the Empyrean. Limbs elongated into snapping appendages, while jagged maws tore open across torsos, screaming blasphemies in forgotten, abyssal tongues. In a matter of mere minutes, grotesque covens of the damned were born in the cramped, suffocating corridors of the underdecks. These wretched congregations, completely stripped of their humanity, turned to the darkest of primal instincts. They gathered their weaker comrades, butchering them in frenzied blood sacrifices. They painted the shifting, pulsing walls with arterial crimson in an insane, futile bid to appease the monstrous sentience that was slowly digesting their vessel. There was no longer a chain of command nor a standing defense force to man the shattered barricades. The proud naval ratings and disciplined armsmen of the Imperium had been reduced to a screaming, writhing mob of broken minds and mutated bodies. The weapons meant to repel demonic borders lay entirely forgotten in pooling blood as the crew grovelled before the very anomalies that were tearing them apart. The vessel was dead from within, hollowed out by the sheer terror of an untethered reality. Only the flickering, failing remnants of arcane machinery stood between this floating asylum and the absolute fury of the warp. Deep within the engineerium, the dying heart of the ship groaned its final, agonizing mechanical breath, leaving the esoteric wards critically starved of power. Deep within the armoured heart of the ship, the agony of the sanctified psyker reached its terminus. The tortured soul bound to the primary Gellar generator did not merely perish. He detonated in a geyser of psychic backwash and boiling blood. Flesh ruptured violently against the blessed restraint harnesses. Bone turned instantly to ash. The great brass machinery of the shielding array screamed a final mechanical death rattle as its arcane conduits melted into useless slag. The warding runes carved into the generator bulkheads flashed with blinding brilliance before shattering like brittle glass. There was no mortal klaxon that could adequately herald this ultimate doom. Instead, there was only the terrible physical sensation of the metaphysical floodgates finally giving way. The Imperium did not merely seep into the doomed vessel. It rushed inward with the catastrophic violence of a collapsing ocean trench, drowning the ship in a fraction of a heartbeat. To the mortal crew, it felt exactly like the crushing pressure of freezing water tearing through the compromised hull of a sinking submarine. A wave of absolute, soul-freezing cold swept through every single deck, instantly flash-freezing the ambient moisture in the air. Every breath exhaled by the terrified crew materialized as a flurry of dead grey frost that drifted down upon the metal grating. With the cold came the impossible, paradoxical stench of the unreality beyond the veil. It was a nauseating confluence of cloying sweet incense, heavily ionized ozone, and the sickly reek of rotting meat left to fester in a dying sun. The very atmosphere grew thick, taking on a viscous quality that choked the lungs and paralyzed the vocal cords of the damned. If one could gaze upon this tragedy from the absolute void of the Imperium, the true scale of the cosmic horror would be revealed. The ship had been a solitary, glowing mote of reality traversing an ocean of pure madness, protected only by a fragile, invisible bubble of enforced physics. Now that miraculous bubble popped. The monstrous, swirling currents of the warp, painted in impossible colors that defied the sane spectrum, crashed down upon the tiny metal construct. The thick adamantium hull offered absolutely no resistance to the immaterial tides. In that singular microsecond of exposure, the vessel was fully illuminated to the ravenous gaze of primordial, ageless intelligences. These were the ancient, malevolent sentiences of the deep warp, entities of pure, predatory malice that had been waiting for this exact moment of vulnerability since the ship first tore its way into their unholy realm. On the Grand Command deck, the surviving officers ceased their frantic shouting. The ship chronometers spun wildly backward before shattering in their casings. The overhead lumitubes flickered and died, plunging the bridge into an abyss of shadow illuminated only by the baleful, unnatural auroras bleeding directly through the armor-glass observation ports. Every sane mind aboard understood with horrifying clarity that they were utterly doomed. They were no longer traversing the Sea of Souls, but had been entirely swallowed by it. The reality they had known was gone, replaced by a realm where physics was a cruel joke and nightmares possessed tangible mass. The protective veil of the Emperor had not merely been pierced, it had been entirely eradicated. From the freezing shadows of the lower decks, the first wet tearing sounds of something entirely inhuman began to echo upward through the ventilation shafts. The barrier between real space and the Imperium is no longer merely breached, it is annihilated. Into the suffocating corridors of the doomed vessel pour the apex predators of the great ocean. They are the Neverborn. To call them beasts or monsters is a dangerous oversimplification born of mortal ignorance. They are concepts given agonizing form. They are ancient sins, repressed nightmares, and the darkest impulses of humanity coalescing into impossible anatomies. They are the physical weight of betrayal, the sudden dread of a dying breath, and the ecstasy of unpunished murder made manifest. Forced into an environment of cold steel and sweating flesh, their very existence is an insult to the rational universe. Physics simply breaks down in their presence. Lumbering behemoths of butchery do not tear through adamantium bulkheads. They simply walk through them as if the solid metal were nothing but morning mist. Where their unnatural limbs touch the ship, the deck plating rebels against reality. The iron and plasteel melt, warping instantly into agonizing tapestries of screaming faces that beg for a death they cannot achieve. Against this tide of unreality, the naval armsmen and surviving voidsmen form their desperate firing lines. It is a testament to the iron discipline of the Imperial Navy that they hold their ground, but their courage is utterly futile. Standard Imperial weaponry was forged to purge heretics and Xenos filth, not the foundational fabric of the warp. A synchronized volley of searing las blasts, capable of punching through dense flak armor and shattering Xenos bone, might simply dissipate against a creature composed entirely of crystallized anger, or inflict wounds that instantly seal with dark fire. A desperate voidsman might swing a roaring chainsword into a shrieking horror, only to watch in mind-shattering terror as the severed flesh instantly transforms into a torrent of corrosive blood, or a swarm of aggressive warp-bred maggots that devour the weapon from the hilt down. This is the true, unnatural terror of fighting the denizens of the warp. They do not bleed as mortals do. They do not obey the laws of thermodynamics, gravity, or biological limitation. To fight a demon is to wage war against a localized breakdown of sanity itself. Every deafening blast of a naval shot cannon, every frantic thrust of a monomolecular bayonet, is a pitiful gesture against a storm of sentient hatred. The entities feeding upon the crew are sustained not by meat, but by the raw terror and despair radiating from their victims. A crewman dragged into the dark is not merely killed. His immortal soul is harvested, his endless pain savored by beings that have observed the slaughter of 1,000,000 worlds since the dawn of time. The massacre in the holds is absolute, a symphony of butchery conducted by the demonic legions of the dark gods. Yet, as the physical slaughter reaches its bloody zenith, the true depth of the breach begins to reveal itself. The howling entities of tooth and blade are only the vanguard of this spiritual infection. As reality continues to rot away within the corridors of the ship, the manifestation of pure chaos begins to mutate into something far stranger than mere demonic assault. The rules of the material universe have been entirely suspended, paving the way for horrors that target more than just flesh and bone. The tearing of the veil invites horrors far more esoteric than the howling foot soldiers of the dark gods. When the raw stuff of the Imperium floods a void ship, the very laws of physics suffer agonizing, localized deaths. Time and space shatter into violent anomalies that defy all mortal comprehension and break the minds of those forced to witness them. In one blood-soaked corridor, a panicked rating fires his combat shotgun, only to watch the burning pellets freeze, suspended in midair, as the chronal currents abruptly cease. In the shattered medbay, the excruciating lacerations suffered by wounded crewmen violently mutate against all reason. These jagged gashes sprout rows of gnashing, needle-like teeth, voraciously consuming the weeping victims alive from their own flesh outward. Gravitational shear manifests without warning, twisting with such catastrophic force that adamantium bulkheads and entire habitation decks are torn in half, crushing hundreds in a sudden singularity of grinding metal. There is no tactical defense against the total dissolution of reality itself. Naval barricades, synchronized volleys, and desperate acts of heroism are rendered utterly meaningless when the geometry of the corridors begins to breathe, bleed, and scream. The magnificent vessel is no longer a triumph of human engineering or a fortress of the Emperor. It has been reduced to a mere digestive tract for the warp, an organic labyrinth slowly breaking down the sanity and substance of everything trapped within its belly. It is within this phantasmagoric nightmare that the most abhorrent parasites of the Imperium drift silently into the bleeding decks of the vessel. They are the enslavers, bizarre and ancient parasites of the deep warp that manifest as bloated, leathery spheres of diseased flesh, trailing clusters of writhing nerve tentacles. They do not conquer with rusted blades or demonic hellfire, but through a psychic subjugation so profound it completely rewrites the victim's biology. Sanctioned psychers and frail astropaths are seized by an invisible, suffocating grip that bypasses all armor and wards. The ensuing transformation is an agonizing spectacle of absolute body horror. Under the parasitic dominance of the enslavers, the human form undergoes a grotesque and terminal rebellion. Bones snap, splinter, and re-knit into unnatural, jagged cages. Skin stretches to the point of transparency before tearing as the subjugated host is reshaped into a living, pulsating incubation vessel. These screaming men and women are violently ripped open from the inside out, their expanding ribs and flayed muscle tissue forming a bloody, shivering organic anchor. Through these agonizing flesh tethers, the immaterial parasites anchor their essence to the physical matter of the ship, binding their bloated, tentacled forms to the suffering biology of the mortal crew. To witness such an atrocity is to feel the soul completely fracture. Hardened veterans of 100 grinding campaigns simply drop their weapons, paralyzed by a cosmic terror so pure it extinguishes the very instinct to survive. As the flesh portals widen and the corridors choke with floating, mind-controlling abominations, the battered surviving remnants of the crew are pushed relentlessly backward. They abandon their posts and flee deeper into the labyrinth, driven down into the darkest, freezing bowels of the dying Leviathan, seeking only a shadowed corner where they might await an inevitable doom. The hum of the plasma drives has died, leaving behind a silence more deafening than any artillery barrage. The power grid has failed completely, plunging the lower decks into an abyssal, suffocating pitch. There is no heroism here in the crushing dark, only the frantic scrambling of prey. Terrified armsmen back slowly down narrow, blood-slicked corridors, their boots slipping on the butchered remains of their comrades. The absolute blackness is broken only by the erratic, agonizing strobe of failing emergency lumens and the panicked, sporadic flashes of las fire. Every burst of harsh red light reveals glimpses of a waking nightmare. The air is thick with a choking smog of scorched metal, copper blood, and the cloying, rotten stench of sulfur. Men do not shout orders anymore, they only scream. It is in these final suffocating moments that the true horror of their predicament settles over the doomed crew. In the material realm, a mortal might seek the Emperor's peace, placing the barrel of a sidearm beneath their chin to escape the pain. But they are no longer in the material realm. They are adrift in the Imperium, and the Gellar field is gone. To die here is not to find rest. To die is merely to tear away the frail armor of flesh and surrender the unprotected soul directly to the ravenous entities hunting them. Death is not an escape from the nightmare. It is the gateway to an eternity of conscious, agonizing digestion within the bellies of laughing gods. The armsmen fire their weapons until the power packs melt, not to win, but to delay the eternal damnation of their own essence. Deep within the armored heart of the command bridge, the ship's master realizes this terrible truth. There are no defiant final orders broadcast across the Vox network. There is no heroic roar into the abyss. The final transmission of the captain is a looping, Vox-distorted recording of a fractured mind screaming litanies to the God Emperor. He babbles in the dark, his sanity shattered into devout lunacy as the meter-thick adamantium blast doors of the bridge are slowly peeled open like rotting parchment. The metal groans and shrieks under the impossible pressure of invisible laughing claws. The void outside the ruined doors boils with impossible colors and the chattering voices of a billion unborn fiends. Then the weeping abruptly stops, replaced by a wet, tearing sound that will echo in the ship's cogitators until the end of time. Silence returns to reclaim the vessel, thick and unnatural, as the last spark of human life is systematically snuffed out. The feast of souls has concluded, leaving behind an empty, echoing tomb of cold iron. Yet the physical Leviathan remains, a drifting derelict caught in the turbulent, swirling tides of the warp. Its mighty hull is intact, but its spiritual core has been entirely hollowed out and replaced by a creeping, malignant rot. When the Imperium eventually tires of its playthings, it simply discards them. With a violent and soundless rupture, the bruised fabric of real space tore open to vomit one such derelict vessel back into the cold void. It drifted without power or purpose. Frost gathered on its scarred hull as it floated through the cosmic dark. The colossal ship was a silent tomb caught in the gravity well of an unnamed star. There was no thrum of plasma drives, no vibration of life support, only the haunting silence of a dead Leviathan. An Imperial Navy patrol cutter, drawn by a faint and weeping distress beacon, eventually intercepted the drifting ruin. The void-faring salvage teams breached the outer airlocks with melter cutters, stepping out of the void and into a profound, oppressive stillness. They expected to find a graveyard of the noble dead. They were entirely unprepared to witness what the ruinous powers had left behind. Lumen beams cut through a dense metallic mist that clung to the cold decking like a living breath. As the boarding parties pushed deeper into the unlit corridors, the grisly, altered architecture of the ship revealed itself. The bulkheads were no longer constructed solely of plasteel and adamantium. Human bones, fused ribs, and elongated skulls were seamlessly integrated into the metal walls. The ship had been remade into a grotesque cathedral of screaming faces locked in cold, unyielding iron. In the central chambers, the salvage crews found the remnants of the original crew. Hundreds of men and women had been meticulously turned inside out. Their wet, pulsating organs hung exposed to the stale air, yet their lungs still drew shallow, rhythmic breaths. They were trapped in a vegetative agony, their minds completely shattered, kept miraculously alive by the lingering dark alchemy of the Imperium. The horror extended far beyond the corruption of mortal flesh. Tech priests attempting to salvage the flight logs interfaced with cogitator arrays that had been spiritually defiled. The green phosphor screens did not display standard Imperial script or holy binary cant. Instead, they projected impossible non-Euclidean symbols that defied the fundamental laws of sanity and geometry. Merely looking upon these cursed shifting runes caused the blood vessels in the salvage workers' eyes to violently rupture. Men wept thick tears of blood and fell to the deck plates, clawing at their own faces as their minds collapsed. This is the insidious, creeping truth of a warp breach. Trauma itself becomes an active contagion, a spiritual radiation that infects the soul of anyone who dares to gaze upon the aftermath. The sheer sight of such blasphemous desecration is enough to damn a man forever. Upon receiving the cutter's encrypted Auspex logs, the grim agents of the Ordo Malleus arrived to enforce a ruthless quarantine. The surviving salvage crews were immediately chained and detained. Their memories were violently scrubbed bare by sanctioned telepaths, or their lives were simply ended by the Emperor's mercy to ensure the taint would spread no further. Yet, as the Inquisitors began to decrypt the heavily corrupted chronometer data recovered from the bleeding cogitators, a terrifying new mystery emerged. The impossible dates recorded in the ship logs painted a picture of chronological madness. To survive the physical transmutations of the Imperium is only half the battle. The true horror of the Imperium lies not merely in what it does to flesh and steel, but in what it does to time itself. In the Imperium, time flows as a relentless, unidirectional river. Within the Sea of Souls, time is no river at all. It is a frayed and knotted string, tangled by the capricious whims of unholy gods. A vessel might plunge into the warp and experience what the crew perceives as 3 grueling weeks of continuous, desperate battle against breaching demonic entities. They bleed, they pray, and they die in the dark, fighting to maintain the flickering energies of their failing shields. Yet when they finally tear their way back into the cold light of real space, they find that 3,000 years have passed. Their names have been scrubbed from the ledgers of the Administratum, their families turned to dust, and their home worlds reduced to irradiated cinders. The enigmatic Inquisitors of the Ordo Chronos dedicate their grim lives to untangling these impossible timelines, recording temporal paradoxes that would break the mind of a lesser scholar. Their sealed vaults hold the maddening testimonies of fleets trapped in inescapable nightmares. There are recorded instances of strike cruisers responding to desperate astropathic distress calls only to arrive and realize the signal is their own, broadcast a decade in their own future as they are torn apart by unseen leviathans. Worse still are the vessels cast adrift backward through the currents of eternity. Colossal Imperial battleships have been found floating dead in uncharted star systems, having arrived long millennia before the Emperor ever united the fighting tribes of ancient terror. Then there is the cruelest jest of all. A transport might arrive at its destination perfectly on schedule to the exact second predicted by its navigators. Yet boarding parties find the cavernous decks utterly silent, for every living soul aboard has aged to dust at their stations, enduring millennia of starvation and isolation while the universe outside ticked away mere days. The warp uses time not merely as a dimension, but as a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. It tortures the sanity of the living and mocks the memories of the dead. Yet for all these tragic anomalies, these vessels at least return to the material realm in some recognizable form. We must now turn our mournful gaze to a far darker fate. There are countless cursed armadas that never emerge from the warp on their own. They become ensnared in the deepest eddies of the Imperium, drifting aimlessly as the centuries bleed together into a singular, agonizing eternity. Drawn by strange gravities and malignant currents, these lost ghosts eventually collide in the endless dark, forever binding their shattered hulls and frozen corridors together. Yet there is a fate darker still than temporal distortion for those vessels claimed by the Empyrean. When a ship is lost to the howling tides of the warp but somehow avoids absolute annihilation, it is drawn relentlessly into the deep, churning undercurrents of the Imperium. Here, in the lightless depths of the abyss, the gravity of damnation exerts its inexorable pull. Derelict vessels are dragged together by impossible tides, inevitably smashing into other lost ships in a violent symphony of ruin. Through the perverse alchemy of the warp, they do not simply collide, but fuse. This is the birth of a space hulk, an unholy amalgamation of agony born from the corpses of 1,000 dead armadas. Behold the grotesque majesty of these drifting leviathans. A grand cathedral ship of the Imperium, its vaulted macro-chapels still adorned with the decaying bones of forgotten saints, is forcefully melded with the rusted, jagged brutality of an Orc-kill cruiser. Piercing through this tangled architecture is the pale, sorrowful hull of an ancient Eldari wraith ship, its elegant spires crushed beneath mountain-sized asteroids of pure black ice. Bulkheads dissolve and reforge into maddening labyrinths. Corridors loop into impossible geometries where gravity shifts and reality screams. Yet, to call a space hulk a mere graveyard of twisted metal and tortured souls would be a grave underestimation. These colossal structures drift aimlessly between dimensions, but they are far from dead. A space hulk boasts a parasitic ecosystem entirely its own, thriving in the dark, labyrinthine guts of the fused superstructure. Deep within the cavernous holes, horrors from across the galaxy take refuge. Broods of gin-stealers hang suspended in the frozen dark, locked in deep hibernation as they wait for the vibrations of mortal footsteps to awaken them. Tribes of feral orcs stalk the irradiated lower decks, sustaining themselves on boundless violence and the salvaged scrap of a dozen different civilizations. Most terrifying of all are the lingering warp entities, formless predators and starved demons that nest within the shadows of the twisted iron. They wait with infinite patience, using the colossal mass of the hulk as a Trojan horse. For when the unpredictable tides of the warp eventually vomit the amalgamation back into real space, these nightmares are granted a bridgehead into the mortal realm. Unsuspecting scavengers and bold salvage teams will board the derelict, seeking ancient archaeotech or lost relics of the dark age of technology. Instead, they find only teeth, claws, and the laughing madness of the abyss. Every space hulk is a ticking apocalyptic clock, drifting silently toward Imperial space, carrying with it a dormant catastrophe that threatens to spill out into the stars. The void watches these silent behemoths approach, and the galaxy holds its breath as the true horror of the Imperium prepares to unveil its final revelation. We have spoken of the mutating flesh, the fracturing of time, and the impossible geometry of the Imperium. But these are merely the physical torments, the shallowest layers of a much deeper abyss. In the ancient mythologies of mankind, death was revered as a final rest. It was a quiet curtain falling upon the stage of life, a peaceful drift into nothingness. In the dark millennium, oblivion is a luxury we are no longer afforded. When a mortal heart stops beating within the safety of real space, the soul dissolves into the warp like a drop of water falling into an ocean. Consider what happens when that soul is plunged into the warp while still tethered to a living, screaming mind. Imagine the sheer terror when the flickering bubble of a Gellar field collapses in the deep currents of the Imperium. The reality is the most terrifying truth in this cruel galaxy. Death in the warp is not an end. Death is merely the violent tearing of the veil, the horrific beginning of an unending nightmare. When the field fails, the raw stuff of chaos floods the corridors of the void ship. The crew does not simply die. Their unprotected souls are violently ripped from their physical vessels. They are laid bare before the laughing, hungry gods of the Imperium. There is no dissolution for these unfortunate spirits. They are caught in the jaws of predators older than the stars, torn apart and consumed in a cycle of agony that lasts for eternity. They become fuel for the dark powers, their individuality preserved just enough to ensure they experience every excruciating moment of their own eternal digestion. The true horror lies not in the existence of this cosmic atrocity, but in our willing participation in it. The masters of the Imperium know exactly what awaits in the dark. The High Lords of Terror, the Holy Inquisition, and the ancient navigator houses all understand the steep price of interstellar empire. They know that the Imperium is a realm of infinite malice waiting to feast upon human souls. Yet they continue to feed our ships and our people into the grinding maw of the void. They order the fleets to sail because they must. There is simply no alternative. To cease warp travel is to isolate a million worlds, to watch the Imperium fracture and starve in the cold dark. And so the vast meat grinder of human endeavor turns onward, lubricated by the blood and souls of the countless billions we sacrifice to the tides of the Empyrean. Every single time a human sets foot upon the rusted deck of a starship, they are engaging in a grotesque game of chance. They seal themselves inside a metal tomb, trusting their very existence to archaic machines they do not truly understand. They rely on arcane field generators that, despite their sacred wards, can suffer catastrophic failure without a moment's warning. They pray to the God Emperor that their vessel will break the surface of reality before the fragile shielding cracks. Every voyage is a desperate wager with eternity. Every warp jump is a bloody tithe paid in the dark. They cast a desperate, bloody lot with eternal damnation, knowing that if the Emperor's grace falters, they will not merely die, they will suffer forever, screaming in the dark, endlessly consumed by the laughing madness of the warp.